I'd like to welcome everyone to our few minutes together on the Parsha. This Shabbos is a very special Shabbos. Of course, it's the Shabbos in which we read Behar and Bechukosai together. And because we read these two Parshios together, we're going to catch up with Eretz Yisrael, which is only reading Parshas Bechukosai this week, so that by the time Shavuos comes around, we will all be reading Bamidbar on the Shabbos before Shavuos, and ultimately speaking about Matan Torah on the Yom Tov of Shavuos itself. Parshas Behar and Bechukosai, Behar itself is mainly dealing with the laws of Shemitah, and Bechukosai, the main focus of the entire Sedra are, unfortunately, the 49 curses that are mentioned in connection with the land of Israel if we don't keep the Shemitah. So there is a very interesting connection between Behar and Bechukosai. If you read the beginning of Bechukosai, you'd notice the overwhelming positive response that in Bechukosai Telecho, if you will only go in my statutes, I will give you so many wonderful things. And if you read through those first few psukim, you're impressed by the beauty of the promises and the gifts that the nation as a whole can acquire and achieve through the observance of the commandments. But you know, even in the 49 Tochacha curses, even in those 49 curses, there are some gems that our sages have pointed out that they are not so much of a curse as a blessing. Let me give you one example. In Perek Chav Vav, Pasuk Lamed Beis, right in the middle of the Tochacha, Hashem says, V'hashimosi ani es ha'aretz, and I will make the land desolate. V'shomamu aleha oyevechem, and your enemies will be desolate on the land. All of those hayoshvim ba, that live in that land. Rashi, the great Rashi, immediately makes a comment about the fact that the pasuk says that I will make the land desolate, and your enemies will live there, will be desolate in the land. He says, Zu midah tova. This is a good attribute. It's a good thing. LiYisrael, for the Jewish people. Shelo yimtzeu ha'oyevim nachas ruach ba'artzechem. Your enemies will not have any calmness of spirit in your land. Shetehei shemama miyoshveha, and it will be desolate from its inhabitants. The Jewish people were exiled from the land of Israel almost 2,000 years ago. For about 1,800 of those 2,000 years, there was only a fragment of a Jewish community in that land. The land itself, from north to south, was just about desolate. There was nothing growing. And the owners of the land, over all the centuries, were non-Jews, including the Turks, including the Arabs. They owned it. They lived on it. No one was there. They could have taken it for a song. They could have done what they wanted with the land, and no one would have protested because it was not wanted by anyone. The Jews were the only ones who wanted it, but they couldn't go there for one reason or another. Or maybe they neglected to go there for one reason or another. But we weren't there, and it was up for the taking. And yet, no one took it because it was so desolate. Interesting. Mark Twain went to Israel in 1867, and he published a book about his travels called Innocents Abroad. Let me read you something that he wrote of those travels. It says, it was a land that was a desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given wholly over to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse, a desolation, said Mark Twain. We never saw a human being on the whole route. Hardly a tree or shrub was anywhere. Even the olive trees and the cactus, those fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost totally deserted the country. And when talking about Jerusalem, he said, a fast walker could go outside the walls of Jerusalem and walk entirely around the city in 1 hour. I do not know how else to make one understand how small Jerusalem is. That was in 1867. We are now 150 years later. In a short 150 years, this Sunday, we're going to be celebrating Yom Yerushalayim. We are going to be celebrating the building of Jerusalem, where it would take you hours, literally hours, to walk from one end of Jerusalem to the other, let alone around it, which would take many, many hours. Hundreds of thousands of people living in Jerusalem, building fountains, parks, and yeshivos abound. And the land itself, from the north to the south and from the east to the west, is a miracle of growth and building. Wine country, fertile lands, production, vegetable gardens, exporting loads of food to the whole world. And this is all going on only 150 years later, when the Jews came back. But the promise of this pasuk in the curses came true. The land was desolate to all other inhabitants. The only one that it ever produced for is the Jewish people. This is the fulfillment of a prophecy that the Jewish people are coming back home, that the land is once again giving forth its produce, and we have been gifted to live in that time when we celebrate Yom Yerushalayim this Sunday. However you do it. If you say Hallel, fine. If you don't say Hallel, fine. If you just think about it for a moment and reflect on it, just reflect on the miracle and the gift of what it means to have Yerushalayim in our hands, and the fulfillment of the prophecy that we read in this one pasuk in Parshas Bechukosai. V'hashimosi aniyas haaretz v'shomamu aleha oyevechem, and your enemies will be desolate, as Mark Twain said, it was desolate, and the land will be desolate, but only to the enemies. To the Jewish people, the land is not at all desolate. To the Jewish people, the land is greatly productive, and we have the privilege and gift of going home to our land and enjoying the fruits of our labors. Hashem should bless the Jewish people, that we enjoy this upcoming day of Yom Yerushalayim and all the territories of the Jewish people that are back in our hands, and that we see the fulfillment not only of this promise, but of all the promises that the Jewish people will once again come home and see the rebuilding of our Beis HaMikdash b'meira v'yameinu. Have a great Shabbos.